The rope was the only thing standing between Ethan Cole and the biggest mistake of his life, and he lifted it without a second thought. 12,000 people were watching his live stream at that exact moment, and every single one of them saw his white sneakers step over the line that every sign, every officer, and every ounce of common sense told him not to cross. A woman nearby gasped and pulled her little boy back by the hand. Somewhere behind him, a man with a heavy camera shouted that he was not allowed to do that. Ethan just smiled at his phone screen and kept walking. He had exactly 60 seconds of freedom left, though he did not know it yet. To understand how a 17-year-old boy ended up walking straight toward a royal guard outside one of the most famous palaces in London, you have to understand who Ethan Cole was, or at least who he believed he was. Ethan was the only son of Richard Cole, an American tech millionaire whose company had made more money in 1 year than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Ethan grew up in a mansion with 9 bathrooms, a home theater, and a garage full of cars he was too young to drive. He never heard the word no, not from his teachers, who were quietly reminded how much his father donated to the school, not from his friends, who laughed at every joke he made because his pool parties were legendary, and certainly not from his father, who solved every problem Ethan created with a phone call and a checkbook. By 16, Ethan had turned his boredom into a prank channel online. He filmed himself doing things other kids were too scared to do. He walked into fancy stores in ripped clothes and dropped stacks of cash on the counter. He ordered 1 French fry at a drive-through window. He challenged strangers to arm wrestling matches in shopping malls. The videos were silly, sometimes rude, but mostly harmless, and they earned him just under 900,000 followers who cheered him on and begged for more. The comments always said the same thing: go bigger. Do something crazy. You never go far enough. Those comments lived rent-free in Ethan's head. Then came the London trip. Richard Cole was closing the biggest deal of his career, a partnership with a powerful British investment group worth hundreds of millions. It was the kind of deal that would put his company on a global stage, and he wanted his family beside him for the photos. So Ethan, his father, and his mother Laura boarded a private jet, and by the next morning, they were checked into a 5-star hotel with a view of the city. Richard spent his days in glass towers shaking hands. Laura spent hers in museums and gardens. Ethan spent his complaining. London was old. London was rainy. London was boring. He filmed himself yawning in front of famous landmarks and captioned the clips with sarcastic jokes. His followers laughed, but the views were dropping. He needed something bigger. He needed a moment. He found it on the 4th day. His mother had dragged him along to see the palace, the one with the golden gates and the endless crowd of tourists pressed against the fence. Ethan was scrolling on his phone, half asleep on his feet, when the crowd around him suddenly shifted and murmured. He looked up, and that was the first time he saw the guard. The soldier stood alone on a stone platform beside a small guard box. He wore a bright red tunic with gleaming buttons, white gloves, dark trousers with a razor-sharp crease, and the famous tall black cap made of thick fur that seemed to double his height. In his hands, he held a rifle, angled perfectly against his shoulder. But it was not the uniform that caught Ethan's attention. It was the stillness. The man did not move, not an inch, not a twitch. Tourists waved at him, made faces at him, posed beside the rope for photos, and he stared straight ahead as if none of them existed. A pigeon landed near his boot and pecked at the ground, and the guard did not even glance down. The wind pushed against the tall fur cap, and still he stood, like he had been carved from the same stone as the palace behind him. The crowd found it fascinating. Ethan found it insulting. Something about that stillness got under his skin, in a way he could not explain. Maybe it was because Ethan had spent his whole life demanding attention and getting it instantly. Maybe it was because this man, this stranger in a uniform, seemed to be the one person on Earth who could ignore him completely. Whatever the reason, an idea began to form in Ethan's mind. And like every bad idea he had ever had, it arrived dressed up as a brilliant one. That night, back at the hotel, he posted a teaser to his followers. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "I am going to do something nobody has ever dared to do." The guesses flooded in by the thousands, and Ethan lay in bed smiling at his ceiling, imagining the views, the shares, the fame. He fell asleep thinking he was about to become a legend. He was right about becoming famous. He was wrong about everything else. The next morning was gray and cool, with a soft mist hanging over the city. Ethan told his mother he was going shopping. Instead, he took a car straight back to the palace, arriving just before 11, when the crowds were thick and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. He positioned himself near the rope barrier, started his live stream, and watched the viewer count climb. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000. He flipped the camera to his face and grinned. "All right, everyone," he said, keeping his voice low like he was sharing a secret. "You see that guy over there? The one dressed like a nutcracker? They say these guards are trained to never move, never talk, never react, no matter what. Well, I say everybody has a breaking point." He turned the camera toward the motionless soldier on the platform. "Watch me make this statue crack." The chat exploded. Some viewers typed warnings. "Do not do it. Those are real soldiers. You will get arrested." But far more of them typed the words Ethan wanted to see. "Do it. Do it. Do it." Ethan looked left. Two police officers stood near the gates, chatting with a tourist, their backs half turned. He looked right. A tour group was gathering for a photo, blocking the view of anyone official. This was his window. His heart began to pound, and he mistook the feeling for excitement instead of what it really was, which was the last desperate warning of his own common sense. He silenced it, the way he silenced everything he did not want to hear. Then he lifted the rope and stepped over. The reaction from the crowd was instant. The gasp from the woman with the little boy, the shout from the man with the camera. A dozen phones swung toward him at once, because everyone there understood something that Ethan did not. That rope was not a suggestion. It was a line between the ordinary world and something much older and much more serious, something that did not care how many followers a person had. Ethan crossed the open ground in 10 long strides, his phone held high, his smile wide, his sneakers loud against the wet stone. And then he was there, standing directly in front of the guard, closer than any tourist was ever meant to be. Close enough to see the fine details of the uniform, the polished gleam of the buttons, the small beads of mist clinging to the fur of the tall black cap. Close enough to see the man's eyes. They were steady, focused on some point far beyond Ethan's shoulder, and they did not move to look at him, not even for a second. Up close, the stillness was even more unsettling than it had been from behind the rope. Ethan could hear his own breathing. He could hear the murmur of the crowd rising behind him like a wave. On his screen, the viewer count jumped past 20,000, and the numbers gave him courage that he had no right to feel. "Hello," Ethan said loudly, waving his free hand in front of the soldier's face. "Anyone home in there?" Nothing. The guard's chest rose and fell in slow, calm breaths. His gloved hands stayed locked around the rifle. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Ethan laughed for the camera, but something small and cold had already started to creep up the back of his neck. He ignored it. The whole world was watching now, and Ethan Cole had never once in his life walked away from an audience. He had no idea that the man standing in front of him was not just a soldier in a fancy uniform. He had no idea that this quiet stranger had lived through things Ethan could not imagine surviving, or that millions of people would soon know both of their names, or that the next few minutes were about to split his life into a before and an after. The guard knew none of this either. He simply stood his post, silent and still, the way he had 1,000 times before. And Ethan, grinning into his camera, with 20,000 people cheering him on, leaned in closer and got ready to do the single dumbest thing he would ever do. For a long moment, the whole square seemed to hold its breath. The crowd behind the rope had grown quiet in that strange, electric way crowds do when they sense something is about to go wrong. Ethan could feel hundreds of eyes on his back. On his screen, messages scrolled faster than he could read them, a blur of shock and laughter and warnings. And the viewer count kept climbing, like the temperature of a fever. 23,000, 26,000. He tilted the phone so his face and the guard's face were in the same frame, and he winked at his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I present to you the world's most expensive statue." Laughter rippled through the stream. Encouraged, Ethan began to circle the guard slowly, the way a shark circles a boat, narrating as he went. "Look at this guy. Look at him. He stands here all day in a fuzzy hat, in the rain, guarding a building. What a life." He leaned toward the soldier's ear. "Hey, buddy, blink twice if you want to be rescued." The guard stared straight ahead. Ethan tried harder. He planted himself at the soldier's side and copied his posture, chest puffed out, chin high, an invisible rifle against his shoulder. Then he began to march in exaggerated steps, swinging his arms like a wind-up toy, stomping his sneakers on the wet stone. The stream loved it. The crowd did not. Somewhere behind the rope, an older man called out for him to show some respect, and a few voices rose in agreement. Ethan turned toward them, arms spread wide. "Respect for what?" he shouted back. "He is not even doing anything. My little cousin could do this job. Stand still and look grumpy." Boom. "Where is my medal?" He turned back to the guard and looked him up and down like he was inspecting something he might buy. "You know what you are," he said, loud enough for every phone in the crowd to catch it. "You are a minimum-wage toy soldier. A mascot. A guy in a costume, like the ones at theme parks, except at least those guys wave at kids. This whole thing is fake. You are a decoration." The guard's eyes did not flicker, his breathing did not change, and that calm, that total unbreakable calm, did something to Ethan that no insult flying back at him could have done. It made him feel small, invisible, and if there was one feeling Ethan Cole could not stand, one feeling that had driven every reckless stunt he had ever pulled, it was the feeling of being invisible. The comments sensed his frustration and fed on it. "He is ignoring you, bro. The statue is winning. You said you would make him crack. You always talk big and quit. You always talk big and quit." That one landed like a slap. Ethan read it twice, and his jaw tightened. He stepped directly in front of the soldier again. Closer now. Close enough that the tall fur cap threw a faint shadow across his own face. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers an inch from the man's nose. Nothing. He waved his palm across the guard's line of sight. Nothing. He puffed a breath of air at the man's face like he was blowing out a candle. The guard did not even blink out of rhythm. "Unbelievable," Ethan muttered. Then his eyes landed on the strap. The chin strap of the tall black cap ran neatly along the soldier's jaw, polished leather against clean-shaven skin. It was the only part of the man that looked touchable, and before the smarter part of Ethan's brain could object, his hand was already moving. He reached out and flicked the strap with one finger. The sound it made was tiny. The reaction from the crowd was not. A wave of gasps rolled across the square, sharp and loud, and even Ethan's stream chat seemed to freeze for half a second before erupting. He touched him. He actually touched him. This is going to end so badly. Near the gates, one of the police officers finally turned around, saw a boy standing where no boy should be, and started walking fast. Ethan saw none of this. His eyes, and his camera, were locked on the guard's face, hunting for a crack that never came. The soldier's jaw was set, his gaze was steel, and somehow, impossibly, he still had not moved. "Okay," Ethan breathed, half laughing, half furious. "Okay, you want to play statues? Let's see how you like this." He reached for the rifle. His fingers had barely brushed the polished wood when the statue came to life. The guard slammed the butt of the rifle down against the stone with a crack like thunder, and let out a shout so sudden, so deep, and so powerful that it seemed to shake the air itself. "Step back from the king's guard. Make way." The sound hit Ethan like a physical force. He leapt backward, arms flailing, and his sneakers slipped on the wet stone so that he nearly went down, catching himself at the last second in a clumsy stumble that 40,000 people would later watch in slow motion. The crowd's reaction was instant and deafening. Screams and laughter and cheering all tangled together. Somewhere, a child started crying. A tour guide dropped her umbrella. For one heartbeat, Ethan stood frozen, his own heart hammering against his ribs, his ears ringing. The guard had already returned to perfect stillness, rifle back against his shoulder, eyes forward, as if the eruption had never happened. And that was the moment, right there, when Ethan should have laughed it off, taken his viral clip, and walked away. The clip alone would have gotten him 10 million views. He had won, if a thing like that can be called winning. But Ethan was not thinking about winning anymore. He was thinking about the crowd laughing, and he could not tell if they were laughing with him or at him. He was thinking about the stumble, the flailing arms, the almost fall, all of it captured from a dozen angles. He was thinking that for the first time in his live streaming career, he was the joke. The heat rushed to his face. The last thin thread of his judgment snapped. "He is not allowed to touch me," Ethan shouted at his camera, his voice cracking. "Did you see that? He tried to scare me. Watch this." And in front of 40,000 live viewers, hundreds of witnesses, and every security camera on the property, Ethan Cole stepped forward, and shoved the royal guard hard in the shoulder. The guard rocked back half an inch. That was all. Half an inch, and then solid stone again. But it did not matter, because the moment Ethan's hands made contact, the entire square changed. The rules changed. Whatever this had been before, a prank, a stunt, a rude joke, it was over. This was now something with a name, and the name was written in law. Ethan never even saw the officers coming. One second he was facing the guard with his chest out and his chin up, and the next second strong hands seized both of his arms from behind, and the ground was rushing toward him. He landed on the wet stone with a thud that knocked the breath out of his lungs. His cheek pressed against the cold pavement, his arms drawn firmly behind his back. His phone flew from his hand, bounced once, and came to rest a few feet away. Screen up. Camera pointed at the gray sky, still streaming. 40,000 people watched the clouds drift past while the audio told the rest of the story. The calm, hard voice of a police officer stating that he was being detained. The clicking of handcuffs. Ethan's voice, high and panicked, suddenly stripped of all its swagger, saying words he had never once said in any video. "Wait, please, I am sorry, I was just joking. Please, my dad is, wait, please," and beneath all of it, rising from the crowd behind the rope, came a sound that would haunt Ethan for months. Applause. Real, loud, heartfelt applause, spreading through the square as the officers lifted him to his feet. The people were clapping for his arrest. Somewhere in that noise, the older man who had told him to show respect shouted something that the stream picked up with perfect clarity. "That is what happens, son." They walked him past the guard on the way out. Ethan, hunched and pale with his hands locked behind him, turned his head and looked at the soldier one last time. The guard stood exactly as he had stood all morning, eyes forward, boots planted, untouched and unbothered, as if Ethan Cole had never existed at all. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of rain-streaked windows and radio chatter. Ethan sat in the back of the van shivering, though it was not cold, running through the same thought again and again like a scratched record. "My dad will fix this. My dad fixes everything. He will make a call, and this will all go away by dinner." At the station, they photographed him, took his fingerprints, and emptied his pockets into a plastic tray. The officers were not cruel and not kind. They were something Ethan had never really encountered before, which was completely unimpressed. When he mentioned, twice, that his father was a very important businessman, the officer taking his details did not even look up. She simply asked him to spell his surname. They allowed him one phone call. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the receiver. His father answered on the second ring, and Ethan opened his mouth to explain, but the words dissolved into a mess of half-sentences. Palace, guard, livestream, arrested. There was a silence on the other end of the line, so long and so heavy that Ethan checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Richard Cole spoke 5 words in a voice his son had never heard before, quiet and cold as a frozen lake. "Do not say anything else." The line went dead. Ethan was placed in a small holding room with a metal bench and a wall clock that ticked too loudly. Time crawled. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see a desk where 2 officers were processing paperwork. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant with gray at his temples, was reading through the incident report, and Ethan watched his eyes move down the page with bored efficiency until, suddenly, they stopped. The officer's whole face changed. He read the same line again. Then he sat up straight, let out a low whistle, and turned the page around to show his colleague, tapping one spot with his finger. "Look at the name," he said. "Look at who was on post." The second officer leaned in, read it, and her eyebrows went up. She glanced toward the holding room, toward the window, toward Ethan, with an expression that was almost pity. Ethan pressed closer to the glass, straining to hear. The gray-haired sergeant shook his head slowly, closed the folder, and said 7 words that made the bottom fall out of Ethan's stomach, though he would not understand why for 2 more days. This kid picked the wrong soldier. Out of every guard in this city, he picked that one. Ethan sank back onto the metal bench, staring at the wall, the tick of the clock hammering in his ears. He thought the worst part of this day was behind him. The worst part had not even started. By sunrise the next morning, Ethan Cole was the most hated teenager on the internet. It happened with a speed that no one, not even Ethan, who had spent years chasing viral fame, could have predicted. The live stream had been clipped, cut, captioned, and reposted 1,000 times before he even left the police station. By midnight, the footage had 2 million views. By breakfast, it had 14 million and was climbing so fast that the numbers looked broken. Every version told the same story from a different angle. The boy stepping over the rope, the insults, the flick of the chin strap, the thunder of the guard's voice, the stumble, the shove, the takedown, the applause. Especially the applause. People could not get enough of the applause. News programs in 3 countries ran the clip on morning television. Presenters shook their heads. Commentators used words like disgraceful and entitled and consequences. Somebody slowed down the footage of Ethan's stumble, added dramatic orchestra music, and got 9 million views on that alone. Lip readers were hired to decode what he had whispered to the guard, and their findings sparked a fresh wave of outrage. A famous talk show host looked into the camera and said, "Whoever raised this boy owes that soldier an apology too," and the audience roared. Ethan watched all of it from the corner of a hotel sofa at 6 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket, his face lit blue by his phone, feeling something he had never felt in his life. The internet had always been his playground. Now it had turned on him with its full weight, and the full weight of the internet is a thing no 17-year-old is built to carry. He had been released into his father's custody late the previous night, pending a decision on charges. The car ride back to the hotel had been 11 minutes of the loudest silence Ethan had ever endured. Richard Cole did not shout. He did not lecture. He stared out the window at the passing lights with his jaw clenched, and when they reached the hotel, he said only one sentence: "Go to your room and do not speak to anyone." The next morning, the silence ended, and Ethan learned what his father's anger actually sounded like when money could not fix the problem fast enough. It started with the phones. Richard had 3 of them, and by 8 in the morning, all 3 were ringing without pause. Ethan sat frozen at the breakfast table of the suite, an untouched plate in front of him, listening to his father's side of call after call, each one worse than the last. "Yes, I have seen the video. No, of course I did not know. He is 17, he made a... No, please. Let's not be hasty. Can we at least keep the meeting on the calendar? I understand. Yes, I understand." By the 4th call, Richard had stopped saying "I understand" and started rubbing his eyes. By the 6th, he was pacing. The British investment group, the partnership he had spent 2 years building, the deal that was supposed to be the crown of his career, was falling apart in real time, one polite phone call after another. The signing ceremony scheduled for Friday was postponed. Then the celebration dinner was canceled. Then came the word that no businessman ever wants to hear from a partner, which is the word reconsidering. "Their chairman is furious," Richard said to his lawyer on the 7th call, his voice low and shaking. "His grandfather served in that regiment. Do you understand what that means over here? This is not a public relations problem. This is personal to them. My son put his hands on one of their soldiers in front of the entire world." Ethan slid lower in his chair. His mother Laura sat across from him, and in some ways her reaction was the hardest one to bear. She did not yell. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger, who reminds you of someone you used to know. When he finally croaked out that he was sorry, that it was just supposed to be a video, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I keep thinking about that soldier's mother, and how she might feel watching that clip. Did you think about her even once?" And she picked up her coffee and left the room, and Ethan discovered that disappointment can hurt worse than fury. His own world was collapsing in parallel. The energy drink company that sponsored his channel released a statement by noon cutting all ties. The platform demonetized his account within a day. His follower count, strangely, was exploding upward, gaining hundreds of thousands, but when he opened the app he understood why, and he wished he had not looked. They were not fans. They were spectators gathering at a car crash. Every video he had ever posted was flooded with the same comments. "Statue boy. Hope it was worth it. Go apologize. My whole family stands with the guard." His real friends back home went silent, one by one, like lights turning off down a hallway. 2 days in, one of them sold screenshots of their private group chat to a gossip account, messages where Ethan had bragged about the plan the night before. The betrayal made headlines for another full day. Ethan deleted the app from his phone, then reinstalled it an hour later, then deleted it again, unable to stop pressing on the bruise. Then came the email from his school back in the States, written in the smooth, careful language of lawyers, informing the Cole family that the disciplinary board had opened a formal review of Ethan's enrollment under the student conduct policy, citing behavior that brings the institution into disrepute. The school where his father had donated a library, the school that had never once told him no. Expulsion was now on the table. Meanwhile, the outside world had laid siege to the hotel. Photographers gathered on the pavement across the street, in twos and threes. Then in a crowd, long lenses trained on the revolving doors from morning until night. The hotel posted an extra doorman. Guests complained. On the third evening, a manager in a perfect suit knocked softly on the door of the suite and explained, with enormous politeness and eyes that apologized for every word, that several other guests had expressed concerns, and that perhaps the family would be more comfortable using the service entrance for the time being. The service entrance. Richard Cole, who had stayed in that hotel 11 times and knew the owner personally, went pale and thanked him and closed the door very quietly, and Ethan understood that he had just watched his father be embarrassed for the first time in his life, and that he himself had been the cause. On the fourth day, Ethan tried to go outside. He lasted 19 minutes. He put on a plain hoodie and borrowed sunglasses and slipped out through the service entrance into a gray drizzle, and for 2 glorious blocks he was nobody, just a tall kid walking past shop windows. Then he ducked into a coffee shop, and the girl behind the counter looked at him twice, and her eyes widened, and she turned to whisper to her coworker, and by the time his order was ready, 3 separate phones at 3 separate tables were angled toward him with that fake casualness he knew better than anyone alive, because it used to be his job. Someone near the window said, loudly enough to be heard, "That is him. That is actually him, the Palace Kid." A man by the door stood up. Ethan left the coffee on the counter and walked out fast, then faster, and the last block back to the hotel he flat out ran, splashing through puddles with his hood down and his heart slamming, and it was not until he was back in the suite with the door locked that he realized what the feeling flooding through him actually was. It was the feeling of being hunted. He thought of every stranger he had ever filmed without asking, every unwilling face he had turned into content for a laugh, and he sat down on the floor of the entryway in his soaked shoes and stayed there for a long time. His mother had it worse, in a quieter way. Laura Cole went out to a department store on the 5th afternoon, needing an hour of normal life, and was recognized at the register by a woman about her age. The woman did not shout. She simply looked at Laura and then said, in a calm and pleasant voice, that her nephew was a soldier and that she hoped the whole family was proud of what they had raised, and then paid for her things and left. Laura came back to the hotel with her shopping bags and said nothing about it to anyone, and Ethan only learned it had happened at all because he heard her crying in the bathroom with the tap running, which was a sound he had never heard in his life, and which he would have given every follower he ever had to unhear. The suite shrank around them day by day, room service trays stacked up by the door. The curtains stayed drawn because of the lenses across the street. Ethan's sleep broke apart into strange, shapeless naps at noon, and long staring hours at 4 in the morning. He caught himself checking the peephole before opening the door for the breakfast cart. And one afternoon, standing at the edge of the window, he watched a river of tourists flow along the street below, laughing, taking pictures, heading in the direction of the palace. And it occurred to him, with a cold, clarifying shock, that the world out there had already moved on to enjoy its next thing, while his own world had simply stopped, and that this was the true shape of the fame he had been chasing since he was 15. It was a wave that used you to break against the shore, and it did not care what it left behind. And beneath everything, growing larger every hour like a shadow at sunset, was the legal problem. Richard hired the best defense solicitor in the city, a calm, silver-haired man named Alan Pierce who wore reading glasses on a chain and had a habit of pausing 3 full seconds before answering any question. On the third day, Pierce sat the family down in the suite and explained the situation with the gentleness of a doctor delivering bad test results. The prosecution was considering 2 charges, a public order offense for the incident itself and common assault for the shove. Because Ethan was 17, he would likely be dealt with as a youth, which helped. But the case was now famous, Pierce explained, and famous cases have a way of hardening. The whole country was watching to see whether a rich American boy would face the same consequences as anyone else. Any hint of special treatment would cause an uproar, which brought him to his next point. "Mr. Cole," Pierce said carefully, "I have to ask you to stop making calls." Richard stiffened. Ethan watched his father's face as Pierce laid it out. The calls to well-connected friends, the quiet inquiries about who could be spoken to, the extremely generous donation Richard had offered to a military charity 2 days after the incident, with a request that it be made public, all of it had been noticed, and none of it had helped. In this country, Pierce said, and on this case in particular, that approach will not just fail, it will backfire. I have spent 30 years in these courts. There is no phone call that fixes this. There is no check that fixes this. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan looked at his father, and what he saw frightened him more than the courtroom talk. Richard Cole looked lost. All his life, Ethan had watched his father move through the world like a man with a master key, opening every door. Now, for the first time, they were both standing in front of a door that would not open, and neither of them had ever learned what to do next. It was into that heavy silence, on the afternoon of the 5th day, that Alan Pierce brought the strangest piece of news the family had ever received. He arrived without an appointment, which he never did, and he had an expression on his face that Ethan could not read. He set down his briefcase, took off his glasses, and cleaned them slowly, and for once, his 3-second pause stretched to 10. "I have spoken with the prosecution this morning," he said finally. "There has been a development. It is, in my career, close to unprecedented." Richard leaned forward. Ethan's heart began to thud. "The soldier involved in the incident," Pierce continued, "has made a personal statement to the prosecutors. He has formally asked them to show leniency toward your son." The words landed in the room, like something dropped from a great height. Ethan blinked. Leniency. The man he had mocked in front of the world, the man he had insulted and shoved, the man whose silence he had treated as a joke, was the one person on earth asking for mercy on his behalf. Why? Ethan heard himself ask, in a voice smaller than he intended. Why would he do that? Pierce looked at him for a long moment. "I ask the same question," he said. "I was told the soldier has one condition, and that he wishes to state it in his own words, through the proper channels, in due course. Until then, that is all we know." He paused, then added something that Ethan would think about all night. "In 30 years, I have seen victims demand justice, and I have seen victims demand money. I have never seen this. Whoever this man is, he is not doing what people do." Richard, ever the deal-maker, immediately suspected a trap, or a setup for a lawsuit, or a public relations move by the army. He said so, at length. Pierce listened politely, and then said, "Mr. Cole, I would encourage you to read tomorrow's paper before you finish that theory." Tomorrow's paper. It came out the next morning, and it changed everything. Ethan was alone when he saw it. His father had flown to Edinburgh overnight in a last attempt to save a piece of the deal. His mother was asleep. It was almost midnight of the following day, and Ethan, who had barely slept all week, was lying in the dark scrolling numbly through his phone when the headline appeared at the top of his feed, published by one of the country's biggest newspapers, written by a journalist named Claire Bennett. The headline was 8 words long, and Ethan read it 5 times. "The hero the tourist mocked. The untold story." Below the headline was a photograph, and it took Ethan several seconds to understand what he was looking at. It was the guard. His guard. The statue. The toy soldier. But in the photograph, the man was not wearing the red tunic or the tall black cap. He was wearing a dusty combat uniform under a desert sun, standing with a group of grinning soldiers, and he was younger, and he was laughing, and he had his arm around another young soldier who was laughing too. The caption named him Sergeant Daniel Ashworth. Ethan sat up in bed. His mouth had gone dry. Down in the street below, the city hummed on, and somewhere out there, he now knew, was a man named Daniel Ashworth, who had asked for mercy for the boy who humiliated him. The article stretched on for pages beneath the photo, thousands of words. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen. Some part of him already understood that whatever was written there was going to hurt worse than the arrest, worse than the comments, worse than his father's silence, because it was going to show him exactly who he had chosen to spit on. He took a breath, and he began to read. The article opened with the incident, told in plain words, and Ethan's stomach twisted at seeing himself described in print. But then the story turned, the way a road turns away from a city and into the mountains, and it left Ethan behind and began to climb into a life he could never have imagined. Sergeant Daniel Ashworth, the journalist wrote, was born 34 years ago in a small town in the north of England, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone and nobody has much. His mother worked in a bakery. Money was short, Winters were long, and the local kids made their own entertainment. That was how Daniel, at 7 years old, met the boy who would shape his entire life. A scrappy, gap-toothed kid from 2 streets over named Sam Turner. Daniel and Sam. Sam and Daniel. For the next 11 years, the article said, you never saw one without the other. They built forts by the river. They failed the same math tests. They got caught sneaking into the cinema and had to sweep the lobby for a month to pay it back. And when they were 10 years old, their school took a trip to London, and the 2 boys stood pressed against a palace fence and watched the changing of the guard, and something happened to Sam Turner that day that never came undone. There were photographs in the article, lent by Sam's mother. One showed 2 boys of about 10 in front of the palace gates, and Sam, small and grinning, was saluting. Beneath it was a line from an interview with Sam's mother that Ethan had to read 3 times. From that day on, she said, it was all Sam talked about. He kept a picture of that uniform taped inside his school notebook. He used to say, one day that is going to be me standing there, and everyone will walk past and never know my name, and I will be part of something bigger than me. He thought it was the greatest honor in the world to stand for something. Most kids grow out of their dreams. Sam never did. At 18, the 2 friends enlisted together. The article traced their years in uniform through the words of the men who served beside them. Daniel was the steady one, a soldier the others called the anchor, because nothing rattled him. Sam was the heart of every room, the one who could make an exhausted patrol laugh at the end of the worst day. They rose through the ranks, side by side. They deployed overseas 3 times. It was on the 2nd tour that Daniel Ashworth became, in the quiet words of one of his former commanders, the finest soldier I have ever had the privilege to lead. The article described that day carefully. A patrol in a dusty valley, far from help, an ambush at dawn. 2 young soldiers caught out in the open ground, wounded and unable to move, with no cover for 80 meters in any direction. The rest of the patrol was pinned in place. Radio calls for air support were answered with an estimate of 20 minutes, and everyone present knew the 2 men in the open did not have 20 minutes. Daniel Ashworth did not wait for orders. He handed his commander his radio, and he went. He crossed that open ground alone, under fire, reached the first wounded man, lifted him across his shoulders, and carried him back. Then, when every man in that patrol thought he had already used up all the luck one life contains, he turned around and went out a second time for the other. 80 meters there, 80 meters back, twice. The soldier who described the scene to the journalist said, I have replayed it in my mind 1,000 times. He moved like he was not afraid, but that is not the truth of it. He was afraid. He went anyway. That is the difference, and most people never understand that difference their whole lives. Both wounded men survived. Both were at their children's birthdays last month. One of them named his firstborn son Daniel. For his actions that morning, Sergeant Ashworth received one of the nation's highest honors for bravery. The article noted, almost in passing, that he had never once worn the medal in public, had declined every interview about it for 8 years, and kept it, according to a friend, in a drawer. When a fellow soldier once asked him why, Daniel had answered with a single sentence that the man never forgot. The brave ones are the ones who did not come home. Ethan lowered the phone and stared at the dark ceiling of his hotel room. His heart was beating strangely. He thought about his own trophies, the plaques his channel had sent him for follower milestones, displayed on a lit shelf his father had built for them. He picked the phone back up. The article was not finished with him yet. 3 years ago, it continued. On an ordinary Saturday, Daniel Ashworth was driving home from visiting his mother when traffic stopped on the motorway ahead of him. A car had gone off the road and rolled. Fuel was leaking, and smoke had started to rise from the engine, and a crowd of drivers stood back, filming on their phones, afraid to go closer. Inside the car, a young mother and her 6-year-old son were trapped. Daniel did not stand back. Witnesses described a man in a plain gray shirt who ran past everyone, wrenched at the damaged door until it gave and pulled the boy out, then went back into the smoke for the mother, dragging her clear less than a minute before the flames took hold of the car. And then, while the crowd surged forward and the sirens grew close, the man in the gray shirt simply walked to his own car and drove away. He never gave his name. The rescued mother spent 2 years trying to find him to say thank you, and only recognized him this week, when the whole country suddenly began sharing photographs of a royal guard. There was a quote from her, and reading it did something to Ethan's chest. "My son is 9 now," she said. "He is alive because a stranger decided we were worth the risk. And this week I turned on the television and saw a boy shoving that same man for entertainment, and I had to leave the room." Ethan set the phone face down on the blanket. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he turned it back over, because he had to know the rest, even though some part of him had already guessed where the story was going, and dreaded it. The Army had twice selected Daniel Ashworth for officer training, the fast track, the career path, the better pay. Twice he turned it down. He told his commanding officer, both times, that he belonged with his men, not above them. The soldiers under him repaid that loyalty with a devotion the article struggled to put into words. One of them said simply, "I would follow that man anywhere, and I am not the only one." And then, at last, the article came to Sam. The final tour. Ethan read the paragraphs with his breath held. The journalist handled it gently, in few words, the way you carry something breakable. Sam Turner, 31 years old, the boy who saluted at the palace gates, the man who made exhausted soldiers laugh, was lost on that final deployment. He never came home. The article did not describe the day it happened. It described instead the day of the funeral, in the small northern town, when the streets filled with people, and Daniel Ashworth stood at the front of the procession, gray-faced and perfectly straight, and carried his best friend the last 80 meters, and this time, there was no one to save. Sam's mother gave the journalist one more memory. After the funeral, she said, "Daniel came to our house, and he sat at my kitchen table where the two of them had eaten 1,000 meals, and he made me a promise. He said, 'Sam never got to stand his post. So I am going to stand it for him.' I did not know what he meant. I found out later, when he requested the transfer." Ethan's hands were no longer steady. The transfer, the article explained, was to ceremonial duty in London. Daniel Ashworth, one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation, a man who had turned down promotion twice, had personally requested to put on the red tunic and the tall bearskin cap and stand guard at the palace. Some in the regiment were puzzled. The article quoted a fellow guardsman who was not puzzled at all. "Everyone thinks the stillness is the easy part," the man said. "It is the hardest part. Every hour on that post your feet burn, your back aches, the crowd pokes at you, and you give them nothing, because the moment you crack, you have made it about yourself. And it is not about yourself. Daniel stands that post better than any man I have ever seen, and now the whole world knows why. Every silent hour is a promise kept. He is not standing there for the tourists. He is standing there for Sam." And then came the detail that broke Ethan Cole completely. Inside the tall black cap, tucked into the band, where regulations do not exactly permit it, and where no inspecting officer has ever had the heart to object, Sergeant Daniel Ashworth carries a small photograph. It is creased and faded. It shows two 10-year-old boys in front of a palace fence, and one of them is saluting. The cap, the chin strap, the flick of Ethan's finger. Ethan made a sound he did not recognize, put the phone down, walked to the bathroom, and was sick. Then he sat on the cold tile floor with his back against the tub, and for the first time since he was a small child, he cried, hard and long and without an audience, and no part of it was for himself. He kept seeing his own hand rising toward that cap. He kept hearing his own voice, tinny and proud, saying the words minimum wage toy soldier, to a man carrying his dead best friend's photograph over his heart, or as near to it as a soldier on post can manage. He did not sleep that night. Sometime before dawn, he watched his own video again, all of it, from the beginning, and it was like watching a stranger, some spoiled, smirking stranger, and Ethan hated him with his whole heart. The interview aired 2 days later. It was Daniel Ashworth's first television appearance in his life. Granted, the network said, on his own request, for exactly 4 minutes, to say one thing. Ethan watched it live, sitting between his parents on the hotel sofa, and the room was so quiet he could hear the traffic below. The sergeant appeared in a plain dark suit, no medals, no uniform, and Ethan realized he had never actually heard the man's voice, except for that single thunderous warning. It turned out to be a calm voice, northern and unhurried, the kind of voice that has never once needed to be loud to be heard. The interviewer asked how it felt to be publicly humiliated by a teenager in front of millions. "I have had worse mornings," Daniel said, and almost smiled, and did not elaborate, and the interviewer wisely moved on. She asked why he had requested leniency for the boy. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have seen what happens to young men when the world decides they are finished. I have buried some of them. That boy behaved terribly, but he is 17. If the answer to every terrible 17-year-old is to destroy him, then none of us would have made it to 20. I do not want him destroyed. I want him to learn. There is a difference, and I would like us to remember it." The interviewer leaned forward and asked about the condition. 200 hours, Daniel said. There is a rehabilitation center that looks after wounded and elderly veterans. Men and women who gave more than anyone will ever ask of that boy. He will serve 200 hours there. Real hours. Real work. No cameras, no press, no donations from his family to soften it. And when the hours are done, all of them, if he has learned anything at all, he can come and say to my face what he did. Not before. An apology costs nothing on day 1. Let's see what it costs him on day 200. The interviewer asked what would happen if the boy refused, or quit halfway. Daniel Ashworth looked into the camera for the first time, and it seemed to Ethan, in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up, that the man was looking directly at him. "Then he will have answered the question," the sergeant said, "and everyone can stop wondering what kind of man he is going to be." The interview ended. The hotel room stayed silent. Richard Cole, businessman to his bones, was the first to speak, and he began the way he began every negotiation, saying 200 hours was excessive, that they could propose 50 and a scholarship fund, that his lawyers could structure something reasonable, and that no son of his was going to spend his gap year mopping floors because of one, and that was the moment Ethan stood up. "No," Ethan said. His father stopped mid-sentence. In 17 years, Ethan had said no to bedtimes, to vegetables, to homework, to rules. He had never once said it like this, quietly, on his feet, meaning it. "No deals," Ethan said. "No lawyers, no negotiating, no press release. He is right. Dad, he is right about all of it, and if you try to buy me out of this one, I will walk to that center and sign up myself." His voice cracked on the last words, but he did not sit down. Richard Cole stared at his son as though a stranger had wandered into the room wearing Ethan's face. Laura Cole put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes were shining, and it was the first time in a very long time that she had looked at her son with something other than disappointment. 2 weeks later, the legal matter was resolved, the quiet way. A youth resolution with conditions attached, made possible, everyone involved knew, by the statement of a sergeant who had asked the system for something better than punishment. The school in America agreed to hold its expulsion decision in review, pending, as the letter put it, demonstrated rehabilitation. The Cole family moved out of the 5-star hotel and into a rented flat, because Richard's deal was dead and appearances no longer mattered, and because Laura said, in a voice that allowed no discussion, that they were staying in England until their son finished what he had started. And so it was that on a cold, gray Monday morning, a 17-year-old boy who had once owned the internet stood alone on a wet pavement in front of a modest brick building on the edge of London, with a sign beside the door that read Millbrook Veterans Recovery Center, holding a paper coffee cup he was too nervous to drink, watched by nobody, filmed by nobody, famous for all the wrong reasons, and completely unaware that the next 200 hours were going to save his life. He took a breath, pushed open the door, and walked in. The woman who ran Millbrook Veterans Recovery Center was named Grace Holden, and she had been expecting him. She was somewhere past 60, small and straight-backed, with silver hair pinned up and eyes that took Ethan in from head to toe in about 1 second, and clearly finished the math early. She did not mention the video. She did not mention the guard. She held out a wicker basket. "Phone," she said. Ethan blinked. "I need it for," he began, and then discovered he could not actually finish the sentence, because for the first time in years there was nothing at the other end of that phone that he could honestly call a need. He placed it in the basket. Grace set the basket on a shelf behind her desk, next to a kettle, and handed him a mop. "The floors first," she said, "then the kitchen. Lunch is at 12, and you will help serve it and help clear it. We have 41 residents. They are not props, they are not lessons, and they are certainly not content. They are people who live here. You will learn their names. Any questions?" "No, ma'am," Ethan said, and meant it, and picked up the mop. His first week at Millbrook was the most invisible week of Ethan Cole's life. Nobody asked for a selfie. Nobody whispered when he walked past. A few of the residents clearly knew exactly who he was. He could tell by the way conversations paused half a beat when he entered a room, but nobody said a word about it, and their silence was somehow heavier than all 14 million views had been. He mopped corridors, he peeled potatoes, he carried trays, wiped tables, sorted the donations cupboard, and untangled a decade of Christmas lights, and he did it all badly at first, because he had never really done anything at all, and there is no tutorial video for work. The residents themselves were nothing like he had expected, and everything he had never bothered to imagine. There were men in their 90s who had served in wars from history textbooks, and there were men and women young enough to make Ethan's chest hurt. There was Peter Moss, somewhere in his 50s, who spent every daylight hour in the garden and had not, as far as Ethan could tell, spoken a full sentence to anyone in years. And there was Harry Finch. Harry was 22, 5 years older than Ethan, and that was all. 5 years. One hallway of high school. He had come back from his single deployment with an injury that ended his career and took most of his right leg, and he was at Millbrook 3 days a week, relearning, with a prosthetic and a physiotherapist, and a temper he mostly kept pointed at himself, how to walk. The first time Ethan saw him, Harry was gripping the parallel bars in the therapy room, sweat running down his face, taking one step, and another, and stopping, and refusing help, and starting again. Ethan stood in the doorway with a stack of clean towels and could not move. He had filmed himself once pretending to collapse from exhaustion after climbing a single flight of stairs. The memory made him want to disappear into the floor. It was in his second week that George Latham decided to deal with him. George was 78 years old, 4 decades retired from the army, sharp as broken glass, and the unofficial king of the Millbrook Common Room, which he ruled from a wheelchair he referred to as the throne. Ethan was clearing teacups that afternoon when George's voice cut across the room like a whip. "You, statue boy." Every head turned. Ethan froze with a cup in each hand. There was no doubt who George meant, and no exit, and nowhere in the entire building to hide. "Come here," George said. Ethan came. Up close, the old man's eyes were pale blue and absolutely merciless. He looked Ethan up and down the way a sergeant looks at a recruit whose boots have failed inspection. "I watched your little film," George said, loudly enough for the whole room. 17 times. My grandson tells me it has been seen. 14 million. He let the number hang in the air. I knew a lad once who did something worth seeing by 14 million people. He pulled 2 of his mates out of an impossible spot and carried them home. Funny thing is, there is no film of it, because everyone present was rather busy at the time. He leaned forward. "So you tell me, boy, you stood an arm's length from Daniel Ashworth, a better man than either of us will ever be, and the very best you could think to do with your one short life was flick his hat. Was it worth it? Did the little numbers on your screen keep you warm this month?" The common room was silent. 40 faces watched Ethan, and there was no camera to perform for, no edit to hide behind, no comment section to drown it out. He stood there with 2 teacups and the truth. "No, sir," Ethan said. His voice came out small, and he made himself continue anyway. "It was not worth it. Nothing about it was worth it, and I would give everything I have to take it back, and I cannot, so I am here." George studied him for a long, long moment. Something moved behind the pale blue eyes, not forgiveness, nowhere near it yet, but perhaps the very first grain of interest. "The tea trolley squeaks," George said at last, turning his wheelchair away. Terrible squeak. A useful young man would find some oil. Ethan found the oil. It was, he understood even at the time, the closest thing to an invitation he was going to get, and he treated it like one. After that, slowly, the way ice thaws, Millbrook let him in. It did not happen in one movie moment. It happened in hundreds of small ones. It happened the first time a resident called down the corridor, not "Hey you" or "Statue boy," but "Ethan, we need a hand in here," and something in Ethan's chest lifted strangely at the plain sound of his own name. It happened over cribbage lessons he kept losing, and war stories he learned to listen to properly, without waiting for his turn to speak, because he had finally noticed he had nothing to say worth interrupting for. It happened in the garden, where he started spending his breaks near Peter Moss, not talking, just working, handing him tools, and where, in his 7th week, Peter silently held out a trowel to him, which Grace Holden later told him, with something almost like a smile, was the most conversation Peter had offered anyone in 3 years. And it happened with Harry. Ethan and Harry became friends the honest way, by arguing about football and music and whether pineapple belongs on pizza. And one gray afternoon, Harry mentioned, in the too casual voice people use for the things that matter most, that the lads from his old unit kept asking him to send a video message for their reunion dinner, and that he kept not doing it, because he did not want them to see him like this. Ethan looked at Harry, who crossed the therapy room on his own 2 feet now, one real and one titanium, farther every single week, and said, "Like what? Exactly. Like someone who did not quit?" And then Ethan said, the only genuinely useful sentence his old life had ever taught him. "I know how to film things. Let me help." They shot it in the garden on a clear morning, Harry standing unaided among Peter's roses, telling his unit he missed them, and that he would be at the next reunion on his own feet, and that the first round was on him. Ethan filmed it carefully, edited it that night with all the skill he had once wasted, and did not appear in a single frame, and never told a soul, and it was the best thing he had ever made by so wide a margin that it was not really a competition. The unit sent back a video of the entire reunion dinner on their feet, cheering Harry's name. Harry watched it 11 times, Ethan watched Harry watch it, and understood, in a single quiet moment of insight, that no one had had to teach him after all, the difference between an audience and people. It was around then that Grace gave him the boxes of photographs. Millbrook had a remembrance wall in its entrance hall, photographs of residents past, of family members lost in service, of friends gone but not surrendered, and decades of pictures had outgrown their frames and faded in shoeboxes in a storage room. Grace asked Ethan, since he was apparently good with such things, to scan and restore and reprint them properly. He spent weeks on it, evenings included, hunched over a borrowed scanner, cleaning scratches from young faces one by one, learning from residents the name and the story behind every single photograph before he would allow himself to hang it. He was halfway through the 3rd box when he turned over a photograph and stopped breathing. 2 soldiers, arm in arm, laughing under a desert sun. He had seen one of those laughing faces before, in a newspaper article he knew nearly by heart. Sam Turner. On the back, in fading pen, someone had written, "Sam and Danny, the terrible twins," and a date. Ethan sat very still for a long time. Of course, he thought. Of course this was the center Daniel Ashworth had chosen. His regiment had roots here. His people were here. There was probably nothing in that man's life, Ethan understood now, that was not connected, by some strong quiet thread, to the men and women he had served with. Nothing was random. Nothing was decoration. Ethan restored that photograph more carefully than any of the others. He reprinted it large, framed it properly, and hung it at the center of the wall, and then he did something he could not entirely explain. He stood in front of it, not for a minute. He stood the way a certain soldier stands, feet planted, hands still, eyes forward, and he stayed there while the light in the entrance hall shifted, and the afternoon wore away. And somewhere past the first hour, his legs ached, and his back complained, and every restless muscle he owned begged him to check a phone that was in a basket behind a desk, and he gave them nothing. And he began, at last, in his bones instead of his head, to understand what he had been mocking on that wet morning in front of the palace. Stillness was not emptiness. Stillness was weight, carried without complaint. It was the heaviest thing he had ever done. He never noticed George Latham sitting in the corridor doorway, watching him the entire time. George never mentioned it. But that evening, for the first time, the old man let Ethan win at cribbage, which among men like George is a decoration of the highest order. Somewhere in those months, without ceremony, the boy from the video quietly died. Ethan deleted his old channel on a Tuesday night. Every prank, every stunt, every view, 900,000 followers gone with a single tap, and slept better that night than he had in years. He stopped counting his hours somewhere around 130, when Grace Holden mentioned one evening, without looking up from her paperwork, that his 200 hours had in fact been complete for some weeks, and that his court obligation was formally discharged. Ethan just nodded and asked whether the weekend shift still needed cover, because Harry had physio on Saturday, and George would want his rematch. Grace said the weekend shift could use him. Her voice was perfectly level. It took Ethan another moment to notice she had already added his name to the rota days ago. His parents saw it happening from a careful distance. His mother drove him to Millbrook every morning at first, then found herself volunteering in the kitchen 2 days a week, then 5. His father came exactly once, in month 4, ostensibly to discuss the school situation, which had resolved itself into a transfer and remote coursework, and no longer frightened anyone. Richard Cole stood in the entrance hall in his 1,000-pound coat, looking lost, and watched his son wheel George Latham past, the two of them arguing happily about a card game, and watched 41 residents greet the boy by name, and something in the great dealmaker's face quietly came apart and reassembled into a different shape. He made a donation to Millbrook the following week. It was enormous, and it was anonymous, and there was no press release, and those last 2 facts, Laura told her son, were the most expensive things his father had ever purchased. And then, on a cold, bright Tuesday in his 6th month, Ethan came in through the front doors carrying tea bags and biscuits for the common room, and stopped, because Grace Holden was standing in the entrance hall with a visitor, and the visitor turned around. Daniel Ashworth wore jeans and a plain navy jacket, and he was somehow both smaller and larger than the figure from the palace, an ordinary broad-shouldered man going gray early at the temples, standing in front of the remembrance wall. He had been looking at the photograph at its center, Sam and Danny, the terrible twins. His eyes, when they found Ethan, were exactly as steady as they had been on that wet morning, and this time they were looking directly at him. Grace took the tea bags from Ethan's hands and vanished the way only truly wise people can, and the entrance hall was empty, except for the 2 of them and 40 years of photographs. Ethan had rehearsed this apology for 6 months, in the shower, on buses, in the dark. Every rehearsed word deserted him instantly. What came out instead was simply the truth, in a voice that shook and kept going anyway. "I am not going to tell you I was young, or that I did not think, or any of that," Ethan said. "I knew there was a person under that uniform, and I decided he did not matter as much as my afternoon. That is the whole of it. That is what I did, and I have had 6 months to understand exactly how much of a person I decided did not matter." He had to stop and steady himself. "I flicked the strap of your cap," he said, and his voice nearly failed him there, "because now I know what you keep inside it, and I think about that every single day, and I am more sorry than I know how to say. Not for what it cost me, for what I did to you, and to him. I am sorry, Sergeant Ashworth. I am so sorry." The entrance hall was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a kettle was coming to the boil, and the ordinary world went on. Daniel Ashworth looked at the boy in front of him for a long moment, and whatever he was searching for, he appeared to find, because the line of his shoulders eased, very slightly, the way it never had at the palace. "Grace tells me you finished your hours weeks ago," he said. His voice was the same calm, northern, unhurried voice from the interview. "And that you keep turning up anyway. That was the part I was waiting to hear about, if I am honest. Anyone can serve a sentence." He glanced at the wall, at the framed photographs, at the laughing faces Ethan had spent his evenings restoring one scratch at a time. Not everyone builds something. Then he did the thing Ethan had not dared to imagine. He put out his hand. Ethan shook it. The grip was exactly what he expected, and the words that came with it he would carry for the rest of his life. "Respect the man, not the uniform," Daniel Ashworth said. "Though between the 2 of us, the uniform should have been your first clue." There was, unmistakably, the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. He nodded toward the photograph of the 2 laughing soldiers. "Sam would have found you hilarious," he added, "right up until he knocked the phone out of your hand. And then he would have made you his project. He was never able to leave a fixable thing unfixed." His eyes rested on the photograph a moment longer. "I suppose some habits are catching." He stayed an hour. He drank tea in the common room, where George Latham greeted him like visiting royalty, and immediately told the story of the squeaking trolley, and Harry Finch stood up from his chair unaided to shake his hand, and Ethan poured the tea and cleared the cups and asked for nothing. Not a photograph, not a post, not a single crumb of the moment for himself. And that, more than anything he could have said, was the apology that landed. 1 year later, on a bright cold morning, an 18-year-old stood in the crowd outside the palace in London, behind the rope, exactly where he belonged. Ethan had come back with his mother, at his own request, on the last day of a visit before he started university, where he had enrolled, to precisely nobody's surprise at Millbrook, in a program combining media and rehabilitation therapy. The crowd around him buzzed and jostled and lifted its phones. On the stone platform by the guard box stood a soldier Ethan had never met. Red tunic, tall dark cap, eyes forward, perfectly still, And Ethan watched him the way you watch a mountain, and felt no urge at all to be noticed by him. He knew now what the stillness cost, and what it carried, and that it was not for him, and that this was exactly as it should be. That evening, he posted a video to a brand new account with 0 followers. It was 4 minutes long. No music, no effects, no sponsor, no advertising. Just Ethan, sitting in the garden at Millbrook, telling the truth, plainly, about what he had done, and what he had learned, and about the men and women who had taught him, protecting every private detail that was not his to share, asking for nothing, and ending with a single sentence. If you ever see a person standing still while the whole world pokes at them, do not ask what is wrong with them, ask what they might be carrying, because I promise you, it is heavier than it looks. He turned off the comments because he was not doing it for the comments, and went to bed. The internet, which had once made him famous for the worst minute of his life, found the video anyway, the way it finds everything, and passed it from hand to hand for the best of reasons this time. Millions watched it. Among them, somewhere in the north of England, a mother who had lost her son held her phone at her kitchen table and watched a stranger's boy talk about the wall where Sam's photograph now hung in the light, restored and laughing, and she was heard to say that it was good, that it was all somehow good, and that Sam would have enjoyed every minute of the whole ridiculous story. And outside a palace in London, through rain and sun and the endless river of the crowd, a soldier stood his post, silent and unmoving, keeping a promise, with a small creased photograph of 2 boys tucked where only he knew it was, giving the world nothing, and holding up more than the world would ever guess. People came from every corner of the earth to stare at him, and laugh and wave and wonder how a man can stand so still. Ethan Cole could have told them, the stillest people are not empty, they are full. And if you are very lucky and very foolish, and the lesson comes for you the hard way, you might just live long enough to understand what they were holding up the whole time, and to stand a little straighter yourself.